The flames danced against the Wyoming sky like demons celebrating another victory. Thomas McKenna had seen enough death in his 43 years. His wife, his son, the dreams that died with them. But when he heard that weak cry from inside the burning cabin, something stirred in his weathered heart. He didn't know that saving one small life would bring an entire nation to his doorstep at dawn, or that his simple act of mercy would rewrite the destiny of two peoples forever. What happens when a broken man's moment of compassion collides with centuries of pain and mistrust? Stay with us through this incredible true story of how one night changed everything. Because sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles. The autumn wind of 1887 carried the scent of coming winter across the Wyoming territory. But Thomas McKenna barely noticed as he guided his plow through the stubborn earth. His calloused hands gripped the wooden handles with the mechanical precision of a man who had lost everything except the will to keep moving forward. The sun hung low on the horizon, painting his modest farmstead in shades of amber and gold, colors that once brought him joy but now only reminded him of Sarah's hair and little Samuel's laughter. 3 years had passed since the fever took them both within a week of each other, leaving Thomas alone with nothing but 160 acres of dreams turned to dust. His neighbors in the scattered settlements had tried to help at first, bringing casseroles and kind words, but grief has a way of pushing people away. Now they whispered that crazy old McKenna had given up on living, just going through the motions until the good Lord called him home. The horse snorted and shook her head, eager to return to the warmth of the barn. "Easy, Belle," Thomas murmured, his voice rusty from disuse. "Just one more furrow, then we'll call it a day." The words felt strange in his mouth. When was the last time he'd spoken aloud? Last Sunday when Pastor Williams tried to coax him back to church? Or was it 2 weeks ago when young Billy Henderson brought news from town? As he turned the plow for the final pass, something caught his eye on the distant ridge. Smoke. Not the lazy gray curl of a chimney, but thick, angry black smoke billowing against the darkening sky. Thomas straightened, shading his eyes with his hand. The old Pritchard place, abandoned for 2 years since the family moved back east after losing their cattle to rustlers. He unhitched Belle with practiced efficiency, his movements sharp and purposeful for the first time in months. Something was wrong. Abandoned or not, that cabin held memories, and fire in these parts could spread faster than a man could think. As he swung into the saddle, Belle seemed to sense his urgency, her hooves finding purchase on the rocky ground as they raced toward the distant glow. The ride took 15 minutes that felt like an hour. With each passing moment, the smoke grew thicker, and Thomas could hear the hungry roar of flames consuming dry timber. As he crested the ridge, the full scope of the disaster hit him like a physical blow. The Pritchard cabin was engulfed, flames shooting through the roof and licking at the sky like demonic tongues. But it was the sound that froze his blood, a weak, desperate cry, barely audible above the fire's roar. Human. Someone was in there. Thomas leaped from his horse before she fully stopped, his boots hitting the ground at a run. The heat hit him like a wall 20 feet from the cabin, but that cry came again, weaker now. Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and dunked it in the nearby water trough, wrapping it around his head and shoulders, as he'd seen the volunteer firemen do in town. "Hold on!" he shouted, though he doubted anyone could hear him over the flames. "I'm coming!" The front door hung askew, flames dancing around its edges like a fiery frame. Thomas took a deep breath of clean air and plunged into hell. The smoke was so thick he couldn't see his own hands, and the heat seared his lungs with each breath. He dropped to his knees, remembering that the air was cleaner near the floor, and began to crawl forward, calling out, "Where are you? Keep making noise." A weak cough guided him toward the back corner, where a pile of old blankets lay in a heap. As his hands touched the bundle, he realized it wasn't just blankets. Someone was wrapped inside, barely conscious. Small hands, delicate features barely visible through the soot and smoke. A girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, her breathing shallow and labored. The roof groaned ominously overhead, timbers cracking under the assault of flame. Thomas scooped the child into his arms, noting how light she felt, how her dark hair contrasted with her pale skin. Native American, he realized with a start, but there was no time to wonder how she'd ended up here. The journey back to the door felt like swimming through liquid fire. The girl's weight, slight as it was, threw off his balance as he crawled through the smoke. His lungs burned, his eyes streamed tears that evaporated before they could fall, and somewhere behind him, he heard a tremendous crash as part of the roof collapsed. They burst through the doorway just as the rest of the structure gave way in a shower of sparks and burning debris. Thomas didn't stop running until they were 50 yards away, where he collapsed to his knees, gasping for clean air while clutching the unconscious girl to his chest. She was alive, barely. Her breathing was irregular, her skin pale beneath the soot, but her heart beat steadily against his chest. As he looked down at her face, something stirred in Thomas McKenna that he thought had died with his family. Purpose. This child needed him, and for the first time in 3 years, someone's life depended on his actions. The ride back to his farmhouse was a careful one, the girl cradled in his arms while Belle picked her way through the darkness. Thomas had rigged a makeshift sling from his shirt to keep her secure against his chest, feeling each shallow breath like a prayer answered. Who was she? How had she ended up in that abandoned cabin? The questions could wait. Right now she needed warmth, clean air, and whatever medical care his rough hands could provide. His farmhouse, modest though it was, had never felt more like home than when he carried her across the threshold. The fire in his hearth had burned down to embers, but it was still warm. He laid her on Sarah's old rocking chair, the one he'd been unable to bear looking at for 3 years, and began the delicate work of cleaning the soot from her face and hands. She was beautiful in the way children are beautiful, all possibility and innocence. Her features spoke of noble heritage, high cheekbones and strong jaw softened by youth. Her clothes, what remained of them, were a mixture of traditional Native American craftsmanship and white man's cloth, suggesting a family caught between two worlds. As the night wore on, Thomas found himself talking to her unconscious form, his voice growing stronger with each word. He told her about Sarah and Samuel, about the farm, about how he'd forgotten what it meant to have someone depending on him. He made her broth from the last of his winter vegetables, spooning small amounts between her lips and feeling victorious when she swallowed. Near dawn, as the first pale light crept through his windows, her eyes fluttered open. They were the color of warm earth, intelligent and aware despite her ordeal. When she saw him, fear flickered across her features, natural enough given the tensions between their peoples, but then she seemed to recognize something in his face that calmed her. "Water," she whispered in English, her voice barely audible. Thomas had never moved so fast in his life, bringing her cool water in his best china cup, Sarah's wedding gift from her mother. As she drank, he watched color return to her cheeks and felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. "What's your name, child?" he asked gently. "Little Dove," she replied, then added something in her native tongue that he didn't understand, but sounded like gratitude. Outside, the sun climbed higher, painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and promise. Thomas McKenna, who had spent 3 years learning how to die, suddenly remembered how to live. But he had no idea that this moment of simple human kindness was about to change everything. Not just for him and Little Dove, but for two peoples who had been at war for longer than anyone could remember. Little Dove slept through most of the morning, while Thomas found himself moving with purpose he hadn't felt in years. He checked on her every few minutes, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders or adding wood to the fire. The sound of another person's breathing in his home was both foreign and deeply comforting, a reminder of what he'd lost and a glimpse of what might be possible again. He made coffee strong enough to wake the dead and stood at his kitchen window, watching the horizon with new eyes. The burned remains of the Pritchard cabin sent a thin column of smoke into the clear morning sky, and questions nagged at him like winter wind through loose shutters. What had Little Dove been doing in that abandoned cabin? Where was her family? And why did he feel like someone was watching his farm? Around noon, as Thomas was spooning more broth between Little Dove's lips, she suddenly stiffened in his arms. Her eyes went wide, not with fear but with recognition, and she whispered something in her native tongue that sounded urgent. "What is it, child?" Thomas asked, following her gaze to the window. Then he saw them. They appeared on the ridge like spirits materializing from the earth itself, dozens of mounted warriors silhouetted against the sky. Even at a distance, Thomas could see the proud set of their shoulders, the way their horses moved with the fluid grace of riders born to the saddle. His blood ran cold as old fears rose in his throat. But Little Dove wasn't afraid. She struggled to sit up straighter, calling out words Thomas couldn't understand, but whose meaning was clear. She was calling to them. "Your people?" Thomas asked quietly. She nodded, then looked up at him with those earth-colored eyes full of worry. They think you hurt me," she said in halting English. "White man take Indian girl. They come to fight." Thomas felt his mouth go dry. His rescue would look like kidnapping. His mercy would appear as violation. "Can you tell them what really happened?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Little Dove nodded, but her expression was troubled. "They very angry. My grandfather, Chief Running Bear, he think I dead. They look for me 3 days." She touched her throat gingerly. "I cannot speak loud." The riders were moving down the ridge now, no longer silhouettes but flesh and blood warriors painted for war. At their head rode a man whose bearing spoke of absolute authority, tall, broad-shouldered, with silver threading his dark hair and eyes like chips of flint. Chief Running Bear. Thomas had heard the name spoken with respect and fear in equal measure. A war chief who had never been defeated in battle, a leader who had kept his people free when so many others had been forced onto reservations, a man who had buried 3 sons in conflicts with white settlers and had no reason to show mercy to another. "I have to go out there," Thomas said quietly. She grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "He will kill you," she whispered. "Then you have to make him understand," Thomas replied. "But I won't cower in my own home while good men think ill of me." He checked his rifle out of habit, then deliberately left it leaning against the wall. Whatever happened next, guns would only make it worse. Instead, he picked up the water cup he'd been using to give Little Dove drinks, Sarah's delicate china cup with tiny painted roses around the rim. "What you do?" Little Dove asked, confused. "Something my Sarah taught me," Thomas said softly. "Sometimes the smallest gestures speak the loudest." He stepped onto his porch with the cup in his hands, moving slowly and deliberately. The warriors tensed, hands moving to weapons, but Chief Running Bear raised one hand to still them. The old chief's eyes fixed on Thomas like a hawk studying prey, taking in every detail. The soot stains on his clothes, the burns on his hands, the exhaustion in his face. Thomas walked to the well at the center of his yard, acutely aware of the 24 warriors who could put arrows through his heart before he took another breath. The rope and bucket felt impossibly heavy as he drew up fresh water, filling the delicate cup to the brim. He turned to face Chief Running Bear and offered the cup of water to the war chief who had come to kill him. The silence that followed was so complete that Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Chief Running Bear's eyes narrowed, studying this strange white man who offered refreshment instead of bullets. "You mock me, white man." Chief Running Bear's English was perfect, his voice carrying absolute authority. "No, sir," Thomas replied, keeping the cup extended. "I offer you water because it's what decent people do when someone comes to their home, even when they come in anger." The chief stepped closer, close enough that Thomas could see the pain behind the rage in his eyes, the grief of a grandfather who thought his granddaughter was dead or worse. "Where is Little Dove?" he demanded. "What have you done with my blood?" Before Thomas could answer, a weak voice called from the doorway. "Grandfather." Chief Running Bear's fierce composure cracked like ice in spring. Little Dove stood in the doorway, wrapped in one of Thomas's old quilts, her small hand gripping the doorframe for support. She was pale and obviously weak, but she was whole and unharmed and alive. The cup fell from Thomas's nerveless fingers, shattering on the hard ground as Chief Running Bear strode past him. The fierce war chief became simply a grandfather, gathering Little Dove into his arms with infinite tenderness, speaking rapid words in their native tongue, while tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. Little Dove was speaking rapidly to her grandfather, gesturing toward Thomas, her voice growing stronger with urgency. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but he could hear the rhythm of storytelling, explanation, emphasis, repetition for clarity. Several times she pointed to the distant smoke still rising from the burned cabin, then back to Thomas. Chief Running Bear listened without interruption, his arms never loosening their protective hold on his granddaughter. As she spoke, his expression changed, suspicion giving way to understanding, anger transforming into something else entirely. "She says you pulled her from fire," the chief said slowly. "Says you breathed smoke and burned your hands to save her life." Thomas nodded, not trusting his voice. "She says you gave her water from your finest cup, fed her like she was your own child, spoke to her with kindness when you could have. The chief's voice trailed off. She was hurt and alone, Thomas said simply. What else was I going to do? Chief Running Bear studied him for a long moment, then gently set Little Dove on her feet. He walked to where the broken cup lay in pieces and knelt, gathering the fragments in his large hands with surprising delicacy. This was precious to you, he said. It wasn't a question. It belonged to my wife, Thomas admitted. She's been gone 3 years now. The chief rose, the broken china cradled in his palms like wounded birds. You offered me your wife's memory, he said quietly. You honored me with your greatest treasure. Something passed between the two men in that moment, an understanding that transcended language and culture and generations of mistrust. Chief Running Bear looked at the broken cup, then at Thomas, then at his granddaughter. My people have a saying, the chief said finally. When someone saves your blood, they become your blood. You are no longer Thomas McKenna, white farmer. You are Thomas McKenna, brother to the Lakota, grandfather to Little Dove. The Lakota warriors made camp on Thomas's land as if they'd been invited to stay for Sunday dinner. Chief Running Bear had spoken, and that was the end of discussion. They would remain until Little Dove was fully recovered, and proper ceremonies could be conducted to honor the man who had saved her life. Thomas found himself in the surreal position of hosting 24 Native American fighters on his modest farm. His root cellar, which had seemed well stocked for one lonely man through the winter, suddenly looked painfully inadequate. But Little Dove, who had taken to calling him Grandfather Thomas without prompting, just smiled when he expressed his concerns. Don't worry, Grandfather Thomas, she said with wisdom far beyond her 8 years. My people bring food. We not take from you. Sure enough, the warriors had arrived with pack horses loaded with supplies, dried buffalo meat, wild rice, pemmican, and other provisions. Within an hour of making camp, they had organized themselves with military precision, some tending horses, others preparing food, and a few standing guard on the ridges around his farm. Chief Running Bear had claimed a spot near Thomas's porch, close enough to keep watch over Little Dove, but positioned so he could observe everything happening around the farmstead. The old chief seemed to notice every detail, the worn patches on Thomas's clothes, the repairs needed on his barn, the way weeds had begun to overtake Sarah's flower garden. Your woman, Chief Running Bear said, as they sat sharing coffee in the late afternoon. She tended growing things. Thomas nodded, following the chief's gaze to the neglected garden. Sarah could make flowers bloom in a desert, said growing things kept her connected to the Great Spirit. He paused, realizing what he'd said. I mean, to God. Same spirit, different names, the chief replied with a slight smile. She was wise woman, your Sarah. Garden tells story of grief. Plants die when heart dies. The observation cut deep, because it was true. Thomas had let everything Sarah loved wither and die, as if keeping her memory meant preserving his pain. I couldn't bear to tend it, he admitted. Reminded me too much of losing her. Chief Running Bear was quiet for a long moment, watching a young warrior help Little Dove feed Thomas's chickens. My woman, Little Dove's grandmother, she died 2 winters past. I also let her garden die. He pointed to the young man. That is Soaring Hawk, her grandson, Little Dove's cousin. He tell me wisdom. Grandmother's spirit not in dead plants, her spirit in new growth, new life, new seasons. Thomas watched Soaring Hawk patiently showing Little Dove how to scatter corn for the chickens, noting the gentle maturity in the young man's bearing. He couldn't be more than 20, but there was a depth in his eyes that spoke of responsibility assumed early in life. He's been watching over her since her parents died? Thomas asked. Soaring Hawk and Little Dove, they orphans both. Parents killed by cavalry 2 summers ago during misunderstanding near Fort Laramie. Since then, they live with me, but... The chief's expression darkened. Little Dove, she have visions, dreams of things that come to pass. She say spirits call her to walk between our world and yours. That explained something that had been nagging at Thomas. What was she doing in that cabin? How did she get so far from your camp? She have dream of fire and death, wake crying that someone needs her help. I tell her dreams are just dreams, but she slip away in night. Soaring Hawk track her to old cabin, but too late. Fire already burning. She went there to help whoever was trapped, Thomas said, understanding beginning to dawn. She didn't get caught in an accidental fire. She went toward it. My granddaughter, she have gift and curse, the chief confirmed. heart too big for small body. She feel others' pain like her own pain. As the sun began to set, painting the Wyoming sky in shades of copper and gold, the warriors gathered around a central fire they'd built in Thomas's yard. Someone produced a drum, and soon the evening filled with rhythmic beating and voices raised in traditional songs. Little Dove sat between Thomas and her grandfather, translating bits and pieces of the stories being told. "This song about Great Hunt," she explained, during one particularly energetic performance. "And this one about warrior who save eagle from trap, and eagle become his spirit guide." "What about that one?" Thomas asked as a different rhythm began, slower and more mournful. Little Dove listened for a moment, then looked up at him with serious eyes. "This song about finding family in unexpected places, about strangers who become brothers, about how spirits sometimes use small things to fix big problems." Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of grief that had held him tight for 3 years. Around him, warriors who had ridden here to kill him were sharing their stories, their food, their sacred songs. A little girl who should have died in a fire was alive and laughing, teaching him things about trust and courage he'd forgotten he needed to learn. As the fire burned low and the warriors began to settle for the night, Chief Running Bear spoke quietly to Thomas. "Tomorrow we must talk of serious things. My people face hard winter, pressure from soldiers, white settlers taking more land. Little Dove's vision brought us together. But what we do with this gift, that choice, still before us." Thomas nodded, understanding that this moment of peace was just the beginning of something much larger and more complex. But for now, with Little Dove sleeping safely between them and the stars wheeling overhead, he was content to let tomorrow's challenges wait. After all, he'd learned something important today. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest gestures. A cup of water, a moment of mercy, a child's trust in strangers. Sometimes that's all it takes to change the world. Thomas woke before dawn to hushed voices and movement outside his cabin. Memory flooded back as he saw Little Dove still sleeping peacefully in Sarah's rocking chair, but the space where Chief Running Bear had been sitting was empty. He dressed quickly and stepped onto his porch expecting to find the warriors preparing to leave. Instead, he discovered something that made him stop in his tracks. More horses dotted the distant ridges, dozens of them. The small war party had become something much larger overnight. Chief Running Bear stood at the edge of Thomas's property, speaking in low tones with several other Native American leaders Thomas didn't recognize. Even in the dim pre-dawn light, he could see the gravity in their postures, the weight of important decisions being made. "Grandfather Thomas?" Little Dove's voice was small behind him. "Many people come. Why so many?" Before Thomas could answer, Soaring Hawk approached from the camp, his young face troubled. "Chief Running Bear asks you join council," he said in careful English. "Important talks. About Little Dove, about what her saving means." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He'd hoped that saving Little Dove would end with simple gratitude, maybe a friendship with Chief Running Bear. He hadn't considered that her rescue might have larger implications. As they walked toward the gathering, Thomas saw that representatives from at least 4 different tribal groups had arrived during the night: Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho, and others he couldn't identify. The men were painted and armed as if for war, but their positions around the fire spoke of council, not conflict. Chief Running Bear gestured for Thomas to sit beside him, a position of honor that didn't go unnoticed by the other leaders. Several eyed Thomas with undisguised suspicion. "Brothers," Chief Running Bear began, "I present Thomas McKenna, the man who pulled my granddaughter from fire, who treated her as his own blood, who offered his most precious possession to honor us when we came in anger." An elderly Cheyenne chief with intricate facial tattoos leaned forward. "One good act does not erase generations of broken promises," he said, in accented but clear English. "Why should we trust this farmer when his people steal our lands and slaughter our families?" "Because," came a clear voice from behind them, "he did not know I was Lakota when he saved me." Everyone turned. Little Dove approached the circle, supported by 2 Lakota women but walking on her own strength. Her color was better, her voice stronger, and her eyes held impossible wisdom. "Granddaughter," Chief Running Bear said gently, "this is men's council. This is council about me," Little Dove interrupted with quiet dignity. "I have right to speak." She walked to the center of the circle, small but unafraid. In fire I dream. Spirit voices tell me, this man carry great sadness, great loneliness, his heart closed like winter earth, but when child cry for help, heart open like spring flower. This is test. Will he see child or will he see enemy? Thomas felt his throat tighten. Somehow this little girl had seen straight through to the core of who he was. He see child, Little Dove continued. Not Indian child, not white child. Just child who need help. He risk life, burn hands, breathe poison smoke. He give me water from cup that hold his wife's spirit. She turned to face Thomas directly. In vision, spirits show me what come after rescue. They show me two paths. One path, our people stay enemies, fight until all die or move far away. Other path, she paused, gathering courage. Other path, one white man and one Lakota grandfather become bridge between worlds. The silence that followed was profound. Every man in that circle understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented, a child speaking prophecy, claiming that their meeting had been ordained by spirits. You say spirits show you this vision, the Cheyenne chief said finally. But spirits also show us soldiers coming, more settlers taking sacred lands. How can one white farmer's kindness change rivers of blood? Not his kindness alone, Little Dove replied seriously. Our choice. We can let his kindness plant seed, or we can let fear kill seed before it grow. Thomas found himself speaking, surprising everyone, including himself. I can't speak for all white men, just like you can't speak for all your peoples. But I can speak for Thomas McKenna. My land is open to Chief Running Bear and his people when they need shelter or rest. My stores are shared when hunger threatens. My gun stands ready to defend Little Dove and any of her family against any threat, white or red. Pretty words, the Cheyenne chief said, but his tone was thoughtful. But winter comes. White settlers grow hungry for land. Soldiers grow restless. What happens when your people demand you choose sides? Thomas met the man's hard gaze without flinching. Then they'll learn that Thomas McKenna already chose. I chose the side that saves children from burning buildings. I chose the side that shares water with enemies. I chose the side that sees family where others see strangers. Chief Running Bear placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. My granddaughter's vision shows truth. This man's heart changed from winter to spring in one night. Perhaps other hearts can change also. But how? Asked an Arapaho leader. How do we make one man's kindness grow into something that changes everything? Little Dove stepped forward again. By making more bridges. Grandfather Thomas, he have farm but no family to share it. We have family but winter will be hard, hunting grounds smaller each season. Maybe some of our young ones learn white man's farming. Maybe some white children learn our ways of living with the land. The idea was so simple, so radical, that it left the council speechless. Thomas felt his mind racing with possibilities, Soaring Hawk learning to work the fields, while sharing his knowledge of horses and tracking. Young white farmers learning sustainable hunting practices, water conservation, reading weather signs. Over the next hour, the impossible began to take shape. Not a formal treaty or grand political alliance, but something smaller and more powerful. A network of personal relationships built on mutual respect and shared need. The council was breaking up when riders appeared on the eastern horizon. Thomas felt his blood chill as he recognized the blue uniforms of cavalry soldiers riding hard toward his farm. How many? Chief Running Bear asked Soaring Hawk. 20 soldiers, maybe more. They carry rifles ready. The chiefs began reaching for weapons, old instincts taking over. This was how wars started, misunderstandings escalating into violence before cooler heads could prevail. Wait, Thomas said urgently. Let me talk to them first. They know me, know I'm no threat. Little Dove stepped into the center of the group, her young face determined. No, we show them what Grandfather Thomas showed us. We offer water. We show kindness instead of weapons. Child, Chief Running Bear said gently, soldiers not always accept kindness. Then we learn if spirits truly guide this path, she replied with startling maturity. If fear rules, people die. If trust rules, maybe something new born. The cavalry approached at a gallop, dust clouds marking their passage. Thomas could see their leader now, Captain Morrison, a hard man with little love for Native Americans, but a grudging respect for honest settlers. As the cavalry drew near, Chief Running Bear stepped beside Thomas in a show of solidarity. Little Dove moved to Thomas's other side, her small hand slipping into his with perfect trust. "Remember," she whispered as the horses thundered closer, "seeds only grow if ground prepared to receive them." Captain Morrison pulled his mount to a halt 20 yards away, his hand resting on his saber hilt. His eyes swept the gathering, dozens of armed warriors, tribal chiefs in war paint, weapons within easy reach. "McKenna!" Morrison shouted. "You all right? Are you being held against your will?" Thomas felt the weight of history balanced on his next words. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Captain Morrison, I want you to meet some friends of mine," he called back, his tone as casual as if he were introducing neighbors at a church social. "They've been helping me with some troubles, and I've been returning the favor. Seems we have more in common than any of us expected." "Step away from them, McKenna," Morrison ordered. "We'll sort this out safely." "Can't do that, Captain," Thomas replied steadily. "You see, Little Dove here is my granddaughter now, and Chief Running Bear is family. And where I come from, you don't abandon family just because someone else doesn't understand the relationship." Captain Morrison stared at the unlikely trio, white farmer, Lakota war chief, and small Native American girl, and Thomas could see the man's worldview struggling to process what he was witnessing. "What the hell is going on here, McKenna?" Morrison demanded. Thomas smiled, feeling Sarah's presence in the morning breeze, hearing echoes of Samuel's laughter in Little Dove's quiet breathing, sensing the possibility of a future where children of all colors could grow up as neighbors instead of enemies. "Well, Captain," he said, "it's a long story, but it starts with a burning cabin, a cup of water, and the simple idea that maybe, just maybe, we've all been looking at this wrong." As the sun climbed toward noon, painting the Wyoming landscape in shades of gold and promise, Thomas McKenna prepared to tell the story that would change everything. Not through grand gestures or political treaties, but through the simple revolutionary act of seeing enemies as neighbors, strangers as family, and fear as something that could be overcome by the smallest gestures of human kindness.